British had only 28 divisions in the area that was attacked. Ludendorff had assembled 76 divisions to make the attack, 32 of which took part in the initial infantry assault at 9:40 a.m. on March 21st. The British units were forced out of their front line along most of the front, and the Germans even broke through the second line of defense, the battle zone, along a quarter of the 50-mile front. The attack hit the Fifth Army hardest. To the north, the attack on the Third Army made less progress, but did threaten to cut off the British troops left on the salient following the Battle of Cambrai. By March 24th, the British were being forced even further west, threatening to open a gap between the British and French armies. Pétain, commander of the French armies of the north, visited Haig to warn him that he expected to be attacked at Verdun and could therefore spare no more reinforcements to help the British. Haig communicated his fears of a possible collapse of his army to the War Office and requested a high-level delegation visit France. He also suggested placing General Foch in overall command of Allied operation. Foch's appointment to that position ended any danger of a rift between the Allies. Meanwhile, the German advance soon began to run out of steam as the units involved became increasingly exhausted. Captured British supply dumps, far better provisioned than the blockaded Germans, slowed down the advance when the troops settled in to forage for much-needed supplies.
They had overextended their lines of supply. They had met such success that they advanced tremendously far. The men were exhausted. They were continually being pushed to go further, They captured large stocks of British supplies, food that they hadn't seen in a long time, and liquor. So in some cases, whole units were drunk and tearing into every bit of food they could get their hands on before the officers could go in and get them back in line. But for the most part, they overextended themselves. They couldn't get their supplies to keep that inertia going, that forward movement where they could keep rolling up, and they suffered heavy casualties. They were losing the cream of the crop of their stormtroops that were getting killed and wounded as they continually advanced to the point where they were decimated to the point where their effectiveness was not the same as it was when the offensive started.
The German attack continued to the end of March. The first 3 days of April were quiet, and when the fighting was renewed on April 4th, both sides launched attacks. Finally, on April 5th, Ludendorff recognized that the Great Offensive had failed and canceled any further attacks. The German army had lost between 200 and 300,000 men without achieving their objectives. But just as Schlieffen's armies had outrun their supply trains in 1914, Ludendorff too proved too fast and too successful for his own good. Caught up in their early successes against the British, they simply outran their artillery support. Without artillery to soften the lines ahead of them and debilitate the British resistance, the assault ground to a halt. Stalled at the Somme, Ludendorff turned his armies north toward Flanders, where they were rebuffed again. In desperation, he sent his men back south against the French at the Marne River. But now the Germans were dangerously low on manpower and supplies, and waiting for them alongside the French and British were the Americans. Even after the failure of the Noyon-Montdidier offensive, Ludendorff was still determined to launch his great attack in Flanders. The third offensive, on the Aisne, had left an awkward salient in the line around the fortified city of Reims, and so Ludendorff decided to launch a two-pincer attack, with attacks east and west of the city. Once Reims had been taken and the line straightened out, the Flanders offensive could begin. This was the final significant German offensive of the war. East of Reims, it failed on the first day. West of Reims, some progress was made, and the Germans established a 4-mile-deep beachhead across the Marne. The 5 costly offensives had bled the German army of at least 800,000 casualties, many in the elite units used to spearhead the attacks. In many areas, the new German front line was only weakly held, with newly constructed defenses that lacked the strength and depth familiar in 1915 through 1917. In 1917, all of Europe was on the verge of bankruptcy, yet the Great War went on. Broken and war-weary, the Allies had one hope: fresh troops in America. The problem with this great tide of enthusiasm, though, was that it was based on an utterly mistaken assumption. For America, in truth, had no military might. In April 1916, the United States was as poorly prepared to go to war as any nation in history. It ranked in size 17th in the world. The U.S. Army had fewer than 135,000 troops. The U.S. Marine Corps had only a few thousand men. These troops were not organized or trained for combat, and they lacked even the most basic supplies.
Not very many units actually were fully trained, because they would form these divisions and then they'd get ready to ship one overseas and they would pull people out of the other one. So very few of them had had much training at all. And then toward the end, there were guys literally who'd been drafted and they'd never fired a rifle or anything. I ran across one, I think it was in the 77th Division. They had these guys coming in to join it, and a sergeant was charging one 5 francs to show him how to load his rifle. He'd been in the Army about 4 weeks or something. So it was a rush thing. And of course, one reason, a lot of these guys are going to get killed because they didn't know what in the world was going on.
Yet the brash young Yanks chafed at the bit to prove themselves, and their chance would come soon enough.
The initial groups of Marines that came over, the grand majority of them actually had enlisted prior to the declaration of war. So they had signed on previously for the adventure, and then that changed. But it was about our core, our reason for existence. We're going to go ahead and support that. Now, there's a wide variety of people who enlisted in the Marine Corps. There were definitely still those who it was the only hope that they could have to get a paying job, was to sign over 4 years of their life and go aboard a ship and learn to be a Marine. But by the time of the early 20th century, there was a lot of an impetus for individuals who went, you know what, I don't want to live in Bloomington, Indiana anymore. My parents lived here and my grandparents lived here, and they've been running the same farm for all these years. Now, a lot of them just go to cities, but there was a portion of them that went, I want to see the world. And they go and enlist and join the Marine Corps. And then, of course, you still have the leadership elements, the old NCOs who had fought in the Philippines, who had marched on Samar, who had fought in Cuba, who had been across the briny ocean many times. And they had their experiences to leaven and to lead these sorts of men. I hope that answers the question. I try to put it in a parlance. It wasn't a purely this low social class were in the Marine Corps. No, there were definitely some of those, but it went through all levels of society at that time, which makes it a very unique experience.
With the Germans advancing on the Marne in the vicinity of Chateau Thierry, Major General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was ordered by Allied command to move his 2nd and 3rd Divisions into that area to shore up the French resistance there under French command.
We were trained, and we were trained right down to the bone. We awaited the call. We were no jingos, or we were no screamers around for this or that, but we were trained for war. That was our profession, the regular Marines. And we didn't like the waiting behind the line.
We practically broke open a bottle of champagne when the word came that we were to move the next 48 hours somewhere. We didn't care where. We'd had enough of this business of play acting. We wanted to get somewhere where we could do some damage and get done, get back home.
The 2nd Division comprised 2 brigades, 1 Army and 1 Marine, and totaled about 26,000 men. They rode all day and through the night in transport trucks to reach the lines. On June 1st, Marine Captain Lloyd Williams took up forward positions north of the village of Bussy-les-Bocages near the Belleau Wood. When their French commanders advised them that they were too far forward and should pull back, Captain Williams replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here."
That is correct, sir. The name of the officer fails me, but it's a company commander who's in the 6th Marines, who he's basically told by a passing French officer or liaison officer that this area of the battle was lost.
On the 2nd and 3rd of June, the 5th Marines sporadically exchanged long-range rifle fire with lead elements of the German force in the woods. Belleau Wood, which had been the private hunting reserve for the nearby chateau, was a carefully tended forest with little undergrowth. Its trees, most less than 6 inches in diameter, were so close together that visibility into and through the wood was limited. It was a perfect place for an army, the German army, to take up defensive positions and conceal its numbers.
But the difficulty with Belleau Wood was you never knew where the front was. Little groups of men, of Americans, little groups of Germans got together to fight each other. And while you were fighting in one direction, all of a sudden, without any warning, you would find that there were some Germans to the rear of you, and they had to be mopped up. Clean up, mop up, and move ahead, move ahead.
On June 4th, the Germans attacked the left flank of the American lines from Belleau Wood to the north, engaging the Marines 2nd and 5th at and around Les Mares Farm. With their artillery and machine gun support in place, the Marines were able to repulse the German attack. On the following day, the French command ordered the Marines to take the Belleau Wood. So eager were the Marines to go after the Germans that at 3:45 a.m. on June 6th, when the commander of the Marines reached the front line to give the attack order, many of his men already were 25 yards out and moving forward at double time. As the Marines rushed into the open green wheat field between their lines and the wood, they were met by a hail of German machine gun fire from the cover of the trees. Captain George Hamilton, commander of the 49th Marine Company, rushed among his command, rallying his troops, urging them forward into the wood. There was also a legendary Marine gunnery sergeant, Dan Daly, pushing his men forward.
Well, if you can imagine, Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, winner of the holder of 2 Medals of Honor, standing up despite the German bullets and yelling to all of these men to his left and right, "Get up, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" Resets their mind and they go, well, if that old codger, who is always giving me grief over my buttons not being polished, my weapon not being clean, if he can get up and go do it, well, damn it, I can do it as well.
When the decimated Marine units reached the wood, they plunged in with bayonets fixed. The German troops, stunned at the ferocity of the assault, called the Marines Teufelhunden, or devil dogs. Most of the Kaiser's troops surrendered in fright.
You could also say that the Marines went into it. There were individuals, officers and senior NCOs who knew what battle was, who knew what was going to happen, but the grand majority hadn't experienced what is the combat of the Western Front or combat of that type yet. And really they were the young hunting dog out for the first time. So when they ran forward, it was, we're going. We have the pride of our nation and the pride of the Marine Corps to keep going, mixed in with an exuberance that they didn't know how bad it was going to be. So they rush in, take horrific casualties, but because of that shock, they're able to gain that toehold in Belleau Wood. And once the battalions of the 6th Marines are able to take their places, that begins a new phase of the battle, more of an open, not in a trench, but fighting in amongst the trees and in the towns and on open fields, which is a different kind of experience than what had been the previous almost 4 years of war at that point.
One by one, the German machine guns fell silent. American runners came back from the woods carrying notes to HQ from the unit leaders in the wood that their objectives had been taken. As the machine guns fell silent, the wounded in the wheat field short of the wood began crawling back toward the American trenches. Because of the way they were ordered to advance across open ground, Marine casualties in the Belleau Wood on June 6, 1918, were the highest in the history of the Corps.
I'd like to point two things about Belleau Wood. The assault in Belleau Wood was the largest number of casualties that the Marine Corps experienced in one day up till that point. And the killed and wounded in that that first day's battle on the 6th of June was more than all Marines who had previously died in combat in the United States history in one day.
The fight for the Belleau Wood would continue for most of the month of June. For the Marines who fought there, and for all those who would wear the uniforms after them, it was one of the Corps' proudest moments, and it showed the Germans that the Americans were ready to fight.